The auction yard smelled of damp hay and iron, the kind of scent that clung to the back of the throat and made everything taste of rust. Lanterns swung on crooked posts, throwing restless shadows across the mud where horses shifted, eyes rolling, hooves stamping in nervous protest. A late rain had turned the ground into slick earth, and every step carried the weight of weariness. Men gathered in clusters, boots caked in grime, their laughter carrying louder than the hammer of the auctioneer's gavel. They weren't here to admire beauty. They were here to bargain, to weigh muscle against coin, and to sneer when weakness dared show its face. Elias stood a little apart, hat pulled low against the drizzle, his shoulders squared though his body sagged with a private exhaustion. He had not come for glory or profit. He came because something in him, something he couldn't name, refused to let go of the notion that even in the mud, some things were worth saving. He knew how the crowd saw him. Foolish, stubborn, a man long past his prime. They were not entirely wrong. He had lost much. Land to drought, friends to war, his wife to an accident that had carved silence into his nights. What remained was a man held together by calloused hands and quiet determination, with nothing but the echo of her voice urging kindness when the world turned cruel. The auctioneer barked out another price, voice echoing against the wooden rails. A chestnut mare, spirited and proud, fetched a high bid. Applause cracked through the air, followed by the sound of men congratulating themselves on fine choices. Then the tone shifted. A groan from the back signaled the next arrival. A handler dragged a skeletal shape into the ring. A gray horse with a limp so pronounced it looked as though every step might splinter him. His coat was patchy, ribs laddering beneath thin skin, and one ear hung lower than the other as if it had once been torn. The crowd broke into laughter, jeers rising like smoke. "Who'd waste a coin on that bag of bones?" someone shouted. Another added, "Should have left him for the buzzards." Elias's gaze locked on the horse, and the noise around him dulled. The animal's eyes, dull amber in the lantern light, held a flicker that didn't match the body it inhabited. Not defiance, not even fear, but a stubborn ember of life that refused to go out. Elias knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection on the worst nights, staring back at him when giving up had seemed the easier path. Something inside him stirred, heavy as it was unwanted. The bidding began low, the auctioneer smirking as though the whole performance were a farce. No one raised a hand. Men spat into the mud, shaking their heads. A boy tossed a stone against the rail, laughing when the horse flinched. The auctioneer rolled his eyes, ready to send the creature away unsold. And then Elias raised his hand. The yard stilled for a breath before erupting into louder laughter. "You've lost your mind, Elias," someone bellowed. Another called, "He's buying a ghost." The auctioneer blinked, startled, then slammed the gavel down with a shrug. "Sold, to the gentleman who wants pity more than profit." Elias ignored the words. He stepped forward, taking the lead rope. Up close, the horse smelled of old sweat and neglect, but when Elias laid a hand on the narrow neck, the animal did not recoil. Its head dipped slightly, as though acknowledging the gesture. For the first time in months, Elias felt something other than weariness, a faint, cautious pull of purpose. As the crowd dispersed, still muttering about foolish choices, Elias led the horse out of the yard. Mud sucked at his boots, rain dripped from the brim of his hat, and whispers trailed after him like thorns. Yet he kept walking. The horse stumbled once, nearly going down, but caught itself and moved forward again, step by trembling step. Elias glanced at him and saw it once more. That flicker, that refusal to surrender. He tightened his grip on the rope, his voice quiet enough that only the horse could hear. "Come on, then. Let's see if the world's wrong about both of us." The rain eased as they reached the road, and lantern light faded behind them. What remained was only man and beast, both mocked, both broken, yet bound now by a fragile thread. Neither knew where it might lead, but the night carried them onward, into something unspoken, something waiting. The ranch greeted them with silence. Grass grew tall where fences sagged, and the barn leaned under its own weight, like an old man unwilling to stand straight. Elias led the horse through the gate, every step sinking into mud that smelled of rot and neglect. Ashen. That was the name Elias gave him before the night ended, for the color of burned wood that lingered in his patchy coat. Hesitated at the threshold of the yard. The animal's legs trembled, and then he collapsed, folding into the ground with a sound that startled the crows from the roofline. Elias knelt beside him, mud soaking through his knees, and laid a hand on the sunken flank. "Not here," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not like this." The horse's breathing rasped, shallow but steady. Inside the barn, dust hung thick in the air, catching in the lantern light. Elias pulled fresh straw, though there was little left, and spread it in the corner stall. His hands moved with a rhythm born of years, though those years had passed since he last felt the barn alive with sound. He fetched water, coaxing Ashen to rise with soft words. It took long minutes before the animal staggered upright, ribs straining against skin, but Elias steadied him, guiding him to the stall with a patience that surprised even himself. The nights blurred into routine. Elias rose before dawn, tending to Ashen before anything else. He cleaned sores, brushed dirt from the dull coat, and offered handfuls of grain with a hand that never struck. At first Ashen resisted, ears pinned back, teeth flashing with memory of cruelty. Yet Elias did not flinch. He spoke in low tones, stories without endings. Fragments of his own grief poured into the stillness. He told the horse about the orchard his wife had loved, now overgrown with weeds. He told of the drought that swallowed his crops, of neighbors who once shared laughter but now avoided his gaze. Slowly, Ashen's ears eased forward, as though the weight of those words pressed gentler than any hand. The town noticed. Word spread quick in places where gossip replaced bread. Men at the store laughed when Elias came for medicine, asking why he wasted coin on something too thin to stand, let alone carry weight. "Hay's dear, Elias. Best burn it for warmth than feed it to bones," one sneered. He ignored them, but their words clung to him like burrs. Nights in the barn, he sometimes sat back against the stall, watching Ashen chew slowly, and wondered if they were right. Yet when the horse raised his head, meeting his eyes with quiet steadiness, doubt loosened its hold. Weeks passed, and the change came in whispers, not shouts. A sheen began to return to the coat, faint but certain. The limp remained, but Ashen stood longer, no longer collapsing with every effort. Once, when Elias reached for the brush, Ashen did not flinch. Instead, he leaned ever so slightly into the stroke. Elias froze, brush suspended, then continued, his throat tightening with a strange, forgotten warmth. Trust, however fragile, had begun to root. One evening, clouds gathered heavy over the horizon, and wind rattled the shutters. Elias hurried to secure the barn, expecting Ashen to cower in the corner. Instead, the horse stood tall, ears pricked toward the storm, body taut but unyielding. Lightning carved the sky, thunder rolled close, yet Ashen did not bow. Elias watched, lantern trembling in his grip, and felt something stir. There was more in this creature than frailty. There was spirit, buried deep but unbroken. As the first drops drummed against the roof, Elias whispered into the charged air, "You've got fight in you still." Ashen turned his head slightly, the lantern light catching the dark glint of his eye, and in that moment Elias believed it. For the first time in years, he allowed the thought that perhaps the laughter of men was not the end of a story, but only the beginning of one neither man nor horse had yet dared to imagine. Morning broke with a pale, brittle light, and Elias stepped into the barn carrying the worn saddle that had once belonged to his father. Ashen watched him with wary eyes, the kind of gaze that measured every movement as if weighing old memories against present danger. Elias set the saddle down where the horse could see it and let the silence breathe between them. He knew trust was not a thing taken but given, and only when the heart was ready. The first attempts were clumsy. When Elias lifted the blanket, Ashen sidestepped, nostrils flaring, body coiled to strike or flee. Elias did not force it. He stood still, hand out, letting the horse circle him, smell him, test the ground. Each day he tried again, until at last Ashen allowed the weight of the blanket to rest across his back. The saddle came next, heavier, sharper in memory. Ashen bucked once, twice, sending it crashing to the straw, but Elias lifted it without anger, his breath steady, his voice calm. "We'll try again tomorrow," he murmured. And they did. In those long hours, Elias spoke to him as though speaking to himself. Words of regret, of a wife gone too soon, of promises unkept. He confessed that on nights when the silence grew unbearable, he had nearly given up. Ashen stood listening, ears twitching at the sound, and something in that steady presence pulled Elias back from the edge of his own emptiness. The horse was not just healing. He was mending the man who tended him. One afternoon, the true test arrived. A storm rolled sudden across the valley, fierce enough to break a fence line and send cattle scattering into the hills. Elias's neighbors rushed to gather their herds, their horses straining against reins. Elias looked at Ashen, still lean but stronger now, a fire smoldering where once there had been only ashes. Doubt gnawed at him, yet the moment demanded courage. He lifted the saddle and fastened it firm. Ashen trembled, but did not fight. With a quiet prayer, Elias swung into the seat. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Then Ashen surged forward. The ride was raw, unpolished, but full of determination. Mud splashed, wind whipped, and the herd scattered like waves before them. Elias clung not with force but with faith, guiding with soft pressure, trusting the horse beneath him. To his astonishment, Ashen responded, not perfectly, not without missteps, but with a strength no one believed he possessed. Together they drove the cattle back through broken gates, each stride an act of defiance against every voice that had declared them failures. By the time they returned, neighbors stood frozen, rain dripping from wide-brimmed hats. Silence met them first, then whispers rippling through the crowd. No jeers this time, no laughter, only disbelief. Elias dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady, his chest heaving. He stroked Ashen's damp neck, feeling the quiver of exhausted muscles, and whispered, "We did it." The horse lowered his head, pressing it briefly against Elias's shoulder, and the weight of years seemed to ease. That night, the barn glowed with a warmth Elias had not felt in years. The lantern light shimmered against the boards, and Ashen stood calm, eyes half closed, chewing slow contentment. Elias sat nearby, listening to the steady rhythm of breath and hoof against straw. In the quiet, he realized the laughter of the auction yard no longer echoed. What lingered instead was the memory of thunder, of hooves pounding through storm and mud, of a bond forged in fire and rain. The town would not forget what they had seen, nor would Elias. Something had shifted, not yet complete, but enough to carry them toward whatever trial awaited next. For the first time in a long while, Elias lay down to sleep believing the dawn might hold more than another burden. It might hold promise. The race was announced on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day when the air smelled of dust and apples, when men gathered in the square to measure one another's worth not with words, but with speed and spectacle. Elias had no thought of entering, not until he heard the remarks whispered sharp as knives. He can ride in the rain for cattle, but in daylight, that horse will fold like paper. The laughter carried easily, loud enough to reach his ears even when he tried to ignore it. Pride was not what pushed him forward, but something deeper, a need to show that what had been mocked was not a mistake, but a miracle in motion. He walked to the table, signed his name, and felt the hush that fell as people realized he meant it. On the day of the race, Ashen stood saddled, scars visible in the bright sun, ribs still faint beneath the coat that had not yet fully recovered its shine. The other horses gleamed, coats brushed to mirrors, manes braided, hooves polished. Riders glanced at Elias with half-smiles, certain he was there only to provide entertainment. Yet when Elias stroked Ashen's neck, the horse stilled, eyes steady, as if he understood the weight of what lay ahead. The starting line buzzed with tension. Children clambered onto fences, women spread quilts in the grass, and men jostled for bets. Dust swirled in the air, the taste of competition thick enough to choke. Elias sat tall in the saddle, though his heart hammered. The signal cracked like a gunshot, and they were off. Ashen leapt forward with a burst of power that startled even Elias. Hooves thundered across the packed earth, each stride an act of will. The field surged ahead in a blur of color, riders leaning low, urging with whip and spur. Elias used neither, speaking low instead, words that only his horse could hear. "Steady, boy. We'll find our place." Ashen listened, settling into a rhythm that carried them through the first turn without falter. Halfway through, the leaders began to tire. Horses bred for speed strained under the weight of expectation, sweat darkening sleek hides. Ashen, though less polished, pressed on with unrelenting determination. The crowd roared, voices rising with disbelief as the once-forgotten horse began to close the distance. Every muscle in Elias's body burned, but he leaned forward, his trust placed entirely in the creature beneath him. Then came the stumble. A divot in the track caught Ashen's hoof, and for a breath the world lurched. Gasps rippled through the stands as the horse nearly went down, but with a violent shudder he righted himself, surging forward with even greater force. Elias felt the jolt through his bones, the decision made in that instant. They would not fall. Not today. Not after all they had endured. The final stretch unfolded in a blur. The favored rider lashed his mount, desperate to maintain the lead, but Ashen's stride lengthened, driven not by whip or rein, but by the unspoken bond of survival. The crowd rose to its feet, hats waving, voices breaking with disbelief as the gray horse surged past, carrying Elias across the line a breath ahead of the rest. Silence followed, heavy and stunned, before erupting into thunderous cheers. Men who had once mocked were now shouting his name, children pointing wide-eyed, women clutching hands to hearts. Elias slowed Ashen, dismounted with shaking legs, and pressed his forehead to the horse's damp skin. "You've done the unthinkable," he whispered, voice raw. Ashen blew a tired breath, warm against his cheek, and lowered his head as if in agreement. That night, the barn glowed softly in lantern light. Elias sat against the stall, listening to Ashen's slow, steady breathing, the rhythm of a life no longer fading but rising. For years he had walked under the shadow of loss, believing himself diminished, but now he understood. Redemption was not grand, it was quiet, carried in each step forward when the world believed you would fall. He had not saved the saddest horse. Together, they had saved each other.